Ken. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Mike. We better have a Bible check. This preacher might not have his Bible. Oh, wonderful. That's great. Some of you know the speaker for this morning as well as this week quite well. 46 years ago, on Friday, this man and his mother and father left the United States to go to Africa. So you may notice when he speaks, he has a little different accent than some people who live in Kansas and even Texas where he was born. But we're very pleased that Stan has agreed to come and be with us this week. He has served also in Zimbabwe as a missionary. I preached in that other foreign country called California. And now we're glad that he's come to Kansas to speak his word. If there's any way we can help you to be right with God, we want to help you this week make things right. So Stan, would you come and speak to us from the Word, please?
In Mediterranean climates, the rain comes in the winter. It's cold, it's damp. The rain usually isn't heavy and hard. It just sweeps in. You can almost not hear it. And it falls steadily and strong and for days at times. We remember that in California when we lived out there. So the rain would have probably fallen that winter in good measure. The ground would have been soaked, but it would have been damp and cold, and plants were not quite ready to grow. And then came the spring. The sun came out warm and beautiful and encouraging, and the grass would go green, and there would be wildflowers on the hills. This would be the one time in the year when the countryside was really green in that part of the world. And it was also in this time of year that the Jewish people celebrated the Passover meal. Here was a time of year when pilgrims would filter in from the north and the south, the east and the west. Some scholars think close to 100,000 of them, pouring into the city of Jerusalem. They would have to ascend to get there because the city was located up on a high plateau. And you could almost imagine the scenario as pilgrims with a mounting excitement and with the thrill of seeing the city there in the distance on the ridge. As they approached the city, came closer and closer, and as parents and grandparents put an arm around grandchildren and said, "Here it is. Here is our heritage. Here is the city of Jerusalem, the city of David. Here is where what it means to be truly Israelite comes true." And I suppose the Jewish people might also have noted that while Romans and Greeks and Egyptians have a heritage, that Jerusalem is more than just the capital city for us, for it is our spiritual heritage too. And here it is that our honor and praise to God begins. And as you can imagine them walking into the gates of the city and looking up and seeing Mount Zion. And there they would see the temple of God. Possibly one of the most beautiful buildings, even in Jesus' day, of that ancient time. You could see the marble, you could see the plaster on the pillars all the way around. You could see it dominating the city, and your spirits would lift even farther. In fact, Jewish people, ancient Israelites, had what they called the songs of ascent. Songs that spoke about ascending. And what they would do, this is found in the book of Psalms, they approached the city of Jerusalem, and the closer they came, they would sing these songs. They rose geographically, going up to the city, but their spirits also were raised. Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. Notice the language. "I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." You can imagine the pilgrims raising their eyes to the hills upon which the city of Jerusalem was set, and then saying, "But we look even higher than that for our help." Psalm 122, verses 1 and 2. Psalm 122, verses 1 and 2. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people both now and forevermore. There's the idea of God surrounding his people like a chain of mountains, the strength of granite, and the eternity that would go even beyond the hills. Psalm 126, beginning with verse 1. 126, beginning with verse 1. Did I read the wrong verse a moment ago? I hope somebody was going to check on me. Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2 says, I rejoice with those who said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing in your gates, O Jerusalem. Then the one I read just a moment ago was Psalm 125, verses 1 and 2. Those trusting in Mount Zion. So now, Psalm 125, 1 and 2. When the Lord brought back the captives from Zion, we were like men who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. And then their response to themselves, the Lord has done great things for us. And we are filled with joy. And so here would be the scenario of the people of God coming into the city of Jerusalem at Passover, thinking lofty thoughts, thinking grand thoughts, understanding that this was a part of their heritage. But there was a more sinister part of Passover too, because you see, Passover was their 4th of July. Passover was the time when the Israelite people remembered their freedom from Egypt. Passover was the time when they remembered when they ate the unleavened bread and they drank of the fruit of the vine and they roasted that lamb, how they put the blood on the doorposts and lintels of their house. And then that same night, they swept out of Egypt free men and women. And that was a great moment for the Israelite people. But you see, when thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people converge on Jerusalem during Jesus' day, the analogy wasn't hard to make. When they looked around and saw signs of imperial Rome, the troops, and the symbols of Roman power, the procurator, the governor, there in the city for the celebration of Passover, it wasn't hard for Israelite people to say, well, what God did once, perhaps he can do again. And perhaps we can even help God's hand out a little if we start a rebellion or a riot or anything along that line. And so the city of Jerusalem would be popping with this tension and the possibilities. That is the scene around which Jesus partook of the Lord's Supper. Here is a scene in an upper room. You can imagine perhaps a couple of burning brands, the flickering light. You can imagine 12, 13 men really sitting around this table or reclining around it and partaking of the Passover meal and remembering the scenes of Jewish independence, but then also Jesus instituting his own supper. Now, by way of contrast, let's turn to 1 Corinthians 11, and I'm going to begin with verse 23. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23. Here is the Apostle Paul's inspired version of what took place. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. A man ought to examine himself before he eats the bread and drinks of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. Lo, these many years ago, when I was baptized on a Sunday night. It was my maternal grandfather, Ross Taylor, who baptized me, and it was in Mutare, or Umtali as it was then, and it was the first person he had actually ever physically baptized. And here his grandson came forward. He had spoken that night. Ross Taylor was not an effervescent man. He was not an outgoing, talkative individual, so it took a lot out of him to stand up before a congregation and preach a sermon. He was very thoughtful, he was very wise, but standing in front of people or even talking to one person at a time wasn't easy for him. So he'd give the message, and here his grandson came up, and we came into the baptistry. It had a painting rather like the one here, and we stood there in the water, and he whispered to me, "I forgot what you're supposed to say." Well, I reminded him of something, being, in the name of G, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or something like that. And he said something like that, put me under and brought me out. It took, I'm glad to say, but I also recall I didn't partake of the Lord's Supper that night, so it took a whole week, around to the next Sunday before my first time to partake with the brethren. For whatever reason, we had left the city of Umtali and traveled to Bulawell. So that's where I partook of the Lord's Supper for the first time. And all my life I'd seen my elders, older people than me, partaking of the Lord's Supper. And you look across and they'd pass the crackers and the juice by, and I'd say, oh, okay. And they'd take something and they'd drop their heads and close their eyes. And so that's what I did. I took the bread and I closed my eyes and dropped my head. And I thought, okay, what now? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. What was I supposed to do at this point? It dawned on me that maybe they were praying. So I prayed. And believe me, that's not a bad thing to do at all during the partaking of the Lord's Supper. But it also occurs to me that perhaps I could have used a little pointer. So what I'm going to do, and the message this morning is going to take two forms. There are two cups. The first is the cup of the Lord's Supper, you see. And the second would be the cup of suffering that Jesus faced. Remember, famously in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, "Let this cup pass away from me." So those would be the two cups. And what I thought I would do in the next couple of moments is to say that there are four ways that you could look at the Lord's Supper. And I'm hoping that if we do it this way, you will be able to have something to think of as you partake of the Lord's Supper the next time around. Number one, the first way. Read with me, if you would, back in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 24. "And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" And also, if you note in verse 25, he refers to the cup the same way. "Do this in remembrance of me." Is backwards. Do this in remembrance of me. Look backwards at what Jesus did. Clearly what Jesus is suggesting is look at the events of the cross. Look at the things that led up to the cross. Look at what the cross meant. Look at the spiritual achievements that took place at the cross. One of the nights that we're here, we'll look at that, the spiritual meaning of the cross, the messages and the achievements there that took place. Look back at the cross. May I make some suggestions? Open up your Bible. Look at the descriptions of the crucifixion. Read through the story. It cannot help but move you as you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John's account of the crucifixion. Look backwards and do some thinking. Imagine what it must have been like. You may even want to watch a movie at some point or other to help your imagination. Some people say, well, I imagine even better when I read out of the text. That's fine. That's a good thing. But all I'm trying to suggest is the first way to look at the Lord's Supper is look back at what Jesus did. How he did it. How he was feeling when he did that. What he felt for us when he did that. So the first way to look at the Lord's Supper is backward. Look back at the scenes and don't forget the resurrection. Did I mess up the movie for you? Did I tell you how it ended? So the second way to look at the Lord's Supper is to look outward. If you would, as you're reading in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." You look outward. One of the interesting things about the verb that's used in this passage is it is the classic Greek word for preaching. You proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. If you look earlier in 1 Corinthians, well, let's look earlier in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 21. 1 Corinthians 1:21. For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. The foolishness of what was preached. It's the same word. Keruxa. And the idea that lies behind it is proclamation. Here is a message and it's being proclaimed. Well, did you preach this morning? You say, Stan, I was quiet. I bowed my head, closed my head, but my mouth was shut. Yes, but you preached. You proclaimed where your convictions lay. You proclaimed to all people what was important to you. You proclaimed to all people that this bread and this fruit of the wine was far more than symbolic. It was a part of your life and your heart. By not being here, someone might proclaim his indifference, his apathy, his lack of conviction. So yes, you do proclaim. And so we all preached this morning a message. You proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. A third way to look at the Lord's Supper, if you're still with me in that text back in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Verse 26, for whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death, and then the phrase, until he comes. So the third way to look at the Lord's Supper would be more. I'm not suggesting that the Lord's Supper should be a meal that we take in a jovial and light-hearted manner. I'm not suggesting that we should take it as a joke at all, but I am suggesting that there is a streak of victory running through that story. And there is more than just a death in that story. There's also a resurrection. And so you see there's the vindication from God. We don't feel sorry for Jesus, though we are sorrowful for the pain and suffering, but we see the other side too, the resurrection, the empty grave. And we look forward to the time when he will come again. It is a memorial feast, but it is not a funeral feast. And there is all the difference in the world there. Look forward to his coming again. Oh, a fourth way to look at the Lord's Supper. You might guess it right now. What's that? You look inward. And you know the verses that I'm thinking of as I read this idea. Verse 27, therefore whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. A man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. Now, both of those verses are telling us that we look inward too, into our own hearts. Now, often somebody will make the observation, Stan, I didn't partake of the Lord's Supper because I felt unworthy. And perhaps in some manner they're thinking of this passage right here. Now, I have a question. Who is worthy to partake of the Lord? Who is worthy of the death of Jesus? Was there anyone who ever lived? Certainly there wasn't anybody who ever lived who deserved even a second of Jesus suffering on the cross. And so when we look inward, we're not doing that. It seems to me that the Lord's Supper is an excellent time to review the week that we just lived. It's an excellent time to look back at the mistakes we've made, the sins we've committed. It's an excellent time for us to take these sins, these mistakes, these things that we did, and lay them at the foot of the cross. For that is what the Lord's Supper is about. And what we do at the cross is we admit, we confess, we acknowledge that we sinned. Lord, when I did this, I blew it. I ask, Lord, for your mercy. The blood that you shed on that cross to forgive me. That's a perfect time to do it. And it seems to me that self-examination is probably the hardest thing for most of us to do. The toughest thing for us to do is to look at ourselves. Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, was the one who wrote those lines about, Lord, give us the grace to see ourselves as others see us. It's the toughest thing in the world to say, I blew it. I make mistakes. Lord, please forgive me. And it is so very necessary to our Christian life. 4 ways to look at the Lord's Supper. Are you ready for the second cup? I want you to imagine that Garden of Gethsemane. It wasn't a flower garden. You didn't have petunias and things like that lined out. You had olive trees. It was a garden that had a utilitarian purpose. And it was nighttime. And perhaps there were camps around because of the thousands of pilgrims that had descended on Jerusalem. And Jesus had gone into the Garden of Gethsemane to be by himself, to be with his Lord. And there he prays. And you remember famously how Jesus asked God, Lord, let this cup pass from me. You remember that scene. But what I want to do is go to a statement he makes a little later on the cross. This is found in Matthew 27 and verse 46. Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. About the ninth hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now that's one of the most famous statements that Jesus made on the cross, I suppose. I'm not sure that we do this cry of justice, if we explain it away too glibly and say, oh, well, he didn't mean it, or something like that. It's an astonishing thing for the Son of God to say. It's an amazing thing. Here the Son of God is on the cross speaking of God's abandonment. And one of the things that may run through our minds as we read these words, as we may say to ourselves, oh no, that's not right. God doesn't abandon people. I know it's lying beneath that statement. We say to ourselves in the privacy of our own hearts, if he could abandon Jesus, would he not perhaps abandon me when I really needed it? And we might say those words or something like that to ourselves. Surely we've all felt abandoned by God before. Surely we've all felt times when things were tough and thought, God, are you really there? Are you here to help me? Where is your hand of strength? Maybe that's something that Jesus expressed. I'd like to throw up some suggestions. Was it a lack of faith? When Jesus hung on the cross, did he lose faith in God? Is this consistent with what we read of Jesus in Scripture? Notice with me, if you would please, 1 Peter 1, verses 18 and 19. 1 Peter 1, verses 18 and 19. For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb, what is the next phrase? Without blemish or defect. This is part and parcel of what it means to be a sacrifice to God. You must be perfect. You must be without defect. Jesus was a sacrifice without defect. He was perfect. That's the claim of Scripture. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. 1 Peter 2, 22. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart. I'm sorry, 1 Peter 2, 22. What did I tell you? 1 Peter 2, 22. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. How much sin? He had none. And in his mouth, no deceit. He didn't say anything wrong. Whatever else we can say about that statement on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? We can say this with certainty. No, he did not sin by losing his faith. That's not the explanation. But here's the second explanation some might give. Did God really abandon him? Did God walk away from Jesus and say, that's too tough, that's too difficult, I cannot do anything about it? Something along that line. Does God, is a matter of practice, abandon his people? Please turn with me to Isaiah 41 and verse 10. Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10. This verse speaks of God's practice, the way he does handle us. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. How does God typically treat us? He says, I'm with you. I'll always be with you. My strong right hand, that'll be behind you. This is something we can count on. Humans come and go. People are fickle and forgetful. But God is not. Go back with me to Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? God does not, as a practice, abandon his people. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Here is something you can count on, rock solid, something that will never leave us. Well, what is the meaning then of Jesus' statement on that cross? What I'd like to do is go back to the wording that Jesus himself used. Lord, let this cup pass from me. I remember as a kid reading that passage or hearing it spoken of, I suppose, and wondering what cup he had. Was he there in the garden? Did he have a glass of something? It obviously is a metaphor. It's figurative language for something. But what? What did it mean? Go back with me, if you would, please, to Psalm 75 and verse 8. Psalm 75, verse 8. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs. I love the description here. This picks up a theme that is found hundreds of times in the Old Testament. The idea of the cup or the bowl of God's wrath. And notice the description here. You put the wine in there and you mix spices in, and the result is a chemical reaction, a foaming. And so the idea of looking into this foaming bowl, and then he says he pours it out down to its dregs. Now, my kid, lovely red-headed Tracy, she doesn't like the orange juice with the pith in it. She wants it completely natural without that stuff. And so she'll go in there and say, Dad, you're getting the wrong one, when I'm reaching into the grocery store shelf, because she doesn't want to have all those little speckles of stuff in the bottom of her orange juice, you see. Well, of course, that's part and parcel of orange juice when you squeeze it. I mean, not when you put in, what is that, the sodium sorbate and all the other stuff, but when you actually use oranges, then there will be pieces of pith and orange in the drink. Any of you ever had fresh squeezed orange juice? You know what I'm talking about. And so here the idea is the grapes, you see, have come all the way down to the bottom, the heavy part, maybe the skin and the seeds and all of that, all the way down to the bottom. Did they have seedless grapes in the first century? I sincerely doubt it, but the dregs going all the way down to the bottom, even to that the pith and all of that, and drinking that's a great description of God's anger, God's wrath. Turn with me also then to Isaiah 51, verse 17. Isaiah 51, verse 17. Awake, awake, rise up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, you who have drained to its dregs the goblet that makes men stagger. This too is a lovely description, because you have, normally when people would drink wine, alcoholic wine, and they just drink it all the way back, they'll stagger for one reason. But in this passage is suggesting that it's another reason. It's God's anger that makes people stagger out in a stunned stupor, I suppose. This is a subject that's picked up in Revelation too. Revelation 14, verse 10. Revelation 14, verse 10. I'm only giving you a summary of scriptures that use this theme. He too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which he has been poured full strength from the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. What a terrifying description that is. And it uses that same language of the cup of God's wrath, God's anger. Revelation 16 and verse 19. Are you uncomfortable yet? Revelation 16, verse 19. The great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. I asked you if you're uncomfortable. Ooh, preacher, preached about God's anger today. We prefer to hear love and grace and mercy and all of that. Well, this is, of course, a part of God's personality, His anger, His wrath against human sins. And I suspect one of the reasons we don't want to hear about it is we understand at some level that we deserve it. We deserve His anger. We understand that we need that wrath, that God looks down upon sin, and it does anger Him, in fact. The expression, the cup of the wrath of God, is in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and is throughout speaking about this part of God's personality. So going back to the two statements that Jesus makes, Lord, let this cup pass from me. And the second one, my God, why have you forsaken me? I want to put those two ideas together and say something vital about our understanding of the cross. When Jesus came to the cross, He was taking that cup of the anger of God and He drank it Himself. He took all of God's fury against all the mean-spirited, spiteful, evil things that humans have done from the dawn of creation to whatever we're going to do in our future. And Jesus drank it. And that should be something that makes us stagger in our belief. That should be something that makes us stop and think. Can we ever take our mistakes, our sins, for granted again? When we think about the fact that God did that, and here comes the other side, when Jesus did so, and you may find this hard to accept, when Jesus drank the cup of God's wrath, God did indeed abandon Him. You say, oh no, Stan, that's not right. But you see, He did abandon Jesus because He would not abandon us. And you say to yourself, Stan, surely that's not the way it is. And I'm saying, yes, it is. And you know, and I know, who was worthy and who is unworthy of that. Don't you? You know that the one worthy person died. And the ones who are not worthy live. You know what that's about. We could use fancy theological terminology of vicarious death in His stead. But this is what it's about. He took the heat. He took the punishment. He took the ferocity of our sin and bore it at the cross. The passage was read just a few moments ago should be read again. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. God made Him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in Him He might become the righteousness of God. God made Him who had no sin. Notice it says not to be sinful. Clearly Jesus was not sinful, but to be sin. Notice that Jesus absorbed completely all of the sins of humanity. That is an astonishing thought. How could He have done it? Let me try to end by telling a story. There's a young lady. She's out on the highway driving, and at some point one of those cars with the lights flashing is behind her. She pulls over and the officer says, young lady, you were speeding on that highway. She says, I was. Anyway, he writes out a ticket and she takes it the next week to court. There in court, the judge listens to the evidence, the young lady speaks, the officer speaks, the record is given of what has happened, and at the end the judge renders a verdict. The judge looks up to the young lady and says, young lady, you are, the evidence is clear, guilty of speeding on the highway. Your fine will be $100. And then he gets his gavel and he hammers it and he says, court is out of session. Then he does something unexpected. He walks around and he takes off the black robes of office and he walks up to her and hands her $100 and says, young lady, would you pay the court? Oh, the thing I didn't tell you is the judge was also a father. And it seems to me that this is where the cross has its meaning. Because if we understand the cross as we should, we see God as a just God who will not take sin lightly and who will have His anger against it, but also
also a loving Father who pays the debts. Those two become part of the cross of Jesus, you see. And so we have the two cups, the Lord's Supper cup and the cup that Jesus drank. And we have this morning a decision for you. How will you respond? How must you respond? I suppose you could shrug your shoulders and walk away from it, but I don't think you can. I don't think the meaning of the cross and all the sin that Jesus absorbed that day would make anybody who has a heart walk away from it and say, that is no big deal. So this morning, I'm going to put the heat on those. If you have lived a Christian life that likes to convict you, come back to the Lord. Serve the Lord in your heart. But at the very least, the cross belongs to that. So the second part is, if you are not a Christian, come to Jesus. Come to that cross. Believe in Him. Confess that faith that you feel in your heart. Repent of your sins. Be buried within that vision. The cross calls upon you for that response. You need to come to Him this morning. You said as we stand as we say.
Thanks for watching.